region inside out. And it's a really, really critical time in the Middle East, not just because of Israel, Gaza, but so much going on with this visit by Donald Trump to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar starting tomorrow. He's also going to be visiting the Gulf Cooperation Council for meetings, quite business focused as well, but lots going to be on the agenda to discuss, including, of course, what is happening in Gaza. He's also managed to achieve some sort of rapprochement, or at least temporarily, with the Houthis, and is also seeking to sign some sort of deal, or at least work towards a signing of a deal with Iran. So a huge amount to think about and unpick. My question that I'm going to be exploring with Hadley this hour is what next for the Middle East? And I would invite you to get your calls in to her as part of this conversation on anything you want at all. 0345 6060 973, text 84850, ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. What's next for the Middle East? Hadley, it's lovely to see you. Welcome.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, the timing is pretty fortuitous. Donald Trump is going to be going to Saudi Arabia tomorrow. He's also got meetings with Qatar and the UAE this week. How significant is this trip?
It's an extraordinary coup yet again for the Gulf Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. This was, the first visit from his first administration, and he's really just doing a replay of it. But it wasn't a given. The first call that he received after becoming president was from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, congratulating him, promising, $600 billion plus of investment into the United States. And you'll remember President Trump at that time really talked it up and said, I think I'll get them to $1 trillion. And if I get them to $1 trillion, then I'll head to Saudi Arabia on my first trip. And, details haven't really been forthcoming on those numbers, but it certainly seems as if he's gotten at least most of what he asked for. So it's a really big deal for them that he's coming there first.
Do you think it's going to be quite business focused? Because there's obviously talk about Qatar buying Boeing jets for Qatar Airways, Disney planning a theme park in Abu Dhabi. Yes, there's a lot going on politically in the region, and that will, of course, be weighing on everyone's minds. But this is also about hard economics.
Absolutely. And this is something that the Gulf Arab countries have really shifted focus in recent years towards. And, I've had conversations with Gulf Arab ministers, ambassadors in Washington who've told me, politics is only about 20% of what they do now. But the majority of their time is spent on not diplomacy, but on business deals and with business folks, whether they be in Washington and, in New York. It's interesting, though, because this is something that the president actually understands, right? He's a transactional president. We know this, and he wants to get a deal. So if he can go to the region and say, yes, oil prices are under 60, your economies are hurting, but I've got some cards to play, then it's a win for both sides.
What do you think the countries which he's going to on this trip actually want to get out of it? Because Saudi Arabia clearly is working on its Vision 2030 program. It wants to try and move from a petro-state to an international center for tourism and business. And it's got its grand projects, NEOM, that long... what can you call it, Hadley? It's
the line.
The line in the desert. So very, very ambitious. The UAE wanting to be a center, a tech hub in the region. It wants more NVIDIA chips. And Qatar wants to really position itself as a regional mediator. So they all want different things, don't they?
They do. But in one case, this is really aligns, and that is in terms of their power going forward. Because, when we used to cover Middle East events, I started covering the region in 2009. General news would go stand in front of a bombed out building and say behind me, the bomb and, how many people are dead. And I would look at that and say, okay, but who paid for that bomb to go off and why? Who's paying? Who's dangling the strings at this point? And it's always the people with the money, and the money always came from the Gulf, right? Whether it be Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, et cetera, Kuwait. So take a step back and look at how they've had to, really re-envision their economies. Saudi Arabia has a huge population under the age of 30. They've got to get them employed. Mohammed bin Salman has been leading the charge with that, with his Vision 2030. But again, this is a Saudi that's very different from the one even that President Trump, went to in his first term. They've evolved incredibly rapidly, women in the workforce, women driving. And I think what you're going to see in this trip specifically is a Saudi Arabia more of a global player than you saw before. I mean, now they're, leading in the G20. These are people who are, very much focused on trade deals, whether they be with the West or with the East. You've got to remember a growing relationship with China, the largest foreign direct investor in Saudi Arabia, is China. So this is a country that has significantly evolved, in the UAE as well. I mean, they're a global transport hub. Look at Dubai International Airport. They've had to, make the change to the bigger airport because they've got so much traffic. So these are countries that are in a very different place than they were just a few years ago.
Do you think that there were obviously concerns in the past on human rights in Saudi Arabia? Jamal Khashoggi, we of course remember, something the Saudi government's never taken responsibility for. I mean, do you think that those now are being put to one side for political expediency, given that there are other, to inverted commas, bigger fish to fry?
I think this is something that's been happening for years now. I think it happened under Joe Biden as well. Remember, this is a president who at that time wouldn't even shake the hand of Mohammed bin Salman.
That's right.
But
fist
then,
pump. Fist pump.
boy, they went a begging when they needed to over oil prices. And let's remember, I mean, I think this is a shared issue between administrations. And it all goes back, frankly, even to my early days in the region. Barack Obama announces this shift to Asia, right? We're shifting focus. And the amount of fear that caused in Gulf Arab countries. Are they leaving us behind was essentially the question. And every decision, I think, since that time has really shown that Gulf Arab countries understand that they have to be responsible for themselves and they can't rely just on the United States.
Well, The Economist newspaper this week, leader in its newspaper, saying Saudi Arabia is pulling off an astonishing transformation. Certainly is. I mean, just on the cultural side of it, Hadley, which is interesting. I mean, how much has it changed? Because it seems that Mohammed bin Salman, having been very, very clear and ruthless at acquiring power, has got a vision. He's very young, but he's making significant changes.
He's young, he's sophisticated, he's intelligent. I mean, I had a conversation with him during their first FII. This was their Future Investment Initiative years ago now, and that was at the very beginning of Vision 2030. And we were at a table surrounded by Bob Dudley, who was at BP at that time, one of the guys who was bringing in a huge entertainment complex to the kingdom. And I asked him, there is a perception in the media, in the press, and amongst business folks I speak to, that Saudi Arabia is being essentially run by the McKinseys of the world, if you will. And he looked at me dead in the face and said, listen, I'm going to work with whoever I have to work with to make this a reality, because I understand that for our country to move forward, for our country to be successful, we're going to have to make a complete and utter shift. And frankly, that's what he's done. And every decision since then has been in line with how do we put people to work? How do we make sustainable growth? How do we essentially get our country, wean our country off oil revenues? Now, they haven't done it yet, but that's a huge shift. I mean, we're talking about a very, very large boat to turn around.
Hadley, let's shift to politics. Can I just deal with the elephant in the room? And it's a pretty big elephant, which is when you've got one of the Israeli ministers, Bezalel Smotrich, saying that Gaza will be entirely destroyed and Palestinian population will leave in great numbers to third countries. Some people have described that as ethnic cleansing. How would you put that?
I wouldn't disagree. I think that there is a huge conversation being had in these Gulf Arab countries about what next with Gaza. They put forth a plan a couple of months ago in conjunction with Egypt and Jordan that was dismissed by the White House, essentially. But no doubt that's going to be part of the agenda. What I've seen in the last 24, 48 hours are reports coming out of D.C. by various news organizations that perhaps the president would consider recognizing Palestinian statehood as a way really just to give Mr. Netanyahu.
Have they said this?
This has been reported. I haven't seen it confirmed by the White House. I haven't seen it confirmed, but there are rumors swirling. And that says to me, they're willing to kick Netanyahu up the backside because he hasn't done what they wanted him to do.
But it's interesting, Hadley, because I've been thinking about this. So Trump came in and he came up with this radical plan in a typical Trumpian fashion of looking at Gaza as a real estate play. And effectively Trump Gaza. And we all remember that ridiculous video that was circulating around. But he was basically saying they should be resettled elsewhere and this should be the Riviera of the region. Now, people talk about the Overton window, this whole concept that you, by coming up with something ridiculously on the fringes of acceptability, that you just shift the entire focus of debate. Is that now what's happened? Because if Israel is now planning, as it is saying it is, and this is approved by the cabinet on the 5th of May, that they will move the 2 million population in Gaza to a sliver of 25% of Gaza, and they're going to set up these distribution hubs where you can go and get water and food to survive for 2 weeks, and they're not going to allow any other aid in and out of this place. I mean, this is absolutely hopeless. I mean, is this not the precursor to a full annexation of this territory.
It's a horrific situation. I think that's something that everybody recognizes, particularly in the Gulf. But the question that I continuously have and ask of these ministers and ask of the leadership of all of these countries is, what leverage do you have with Donald Trump? Because at the end of the day, whatever happens in Israel, we know that makes or breaks Netanyahu's career, his political career. And this is a cat with many lives, as we've seen again and again and again. So for him, it is a matter of survival. But also, we've seen that President Trump isn't adverse to pushing back on Israel when he wants to. I mean, he's a big...
Well, when has he done that?
He's pushed back on them on multiple occasions. He's not going to Israel on this trip.
That is true, but do you see that as significant?
Of course it is. There's no way that you can miss this. Were he to tag something on to the back of his trip, you'll realize that somewhere he got his way. Because remember, I mean, the forces in the United States, AIPAC, his MAGA base, the very, very strong pro-Israel folks that are around him right now in the White House, they have even themselves taken a step back. And you've seen this off the back of essentially the U.S. not backing Mr. Netanyahu when he wanted to go after Iran most recently. And the president's done that before, even in his first term. It's
interesting you mention Iran because I wanted to come to that because Donald Trump has been making some pretty positive noises of late. We know that this JCPOA that was signed by Barack Obama before Trump came in the first term, Trump withdrew from that and sort of went south. Israel has wanted to basically take out Iran's nuclear capability directly. The US has got a different view. It looks like they might settle on some sort of enrichment for civilian use. How close do you think this potential deal is, and how big a win will it be?
It would be an incredible win for the president. There's no doubt about it. I mean, this is a man who came off of 2 wins last week. You got an American pope and you got a UK trade deal that, frankly, is better for the United States than it is for the United Kingdom. So he's flying high at the moment. But take a step back and think about what an Iran deal would mean for the Gulf Arab countries. They were the greatest fears, obviously, were coming from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. That was the first time around. And of course, you'll remember that Barack Obama did not consult with them. He went via the Omanis, and that caused all manner of distrust between the White House and the Gulf. That has taken years to repair and perhaps probably never will be fully repaired. And you've seen that in how they've, conducted their foreign policy since, with an eye to the main chance for themselves versus just what the United States would want them to do. In my mind, when you take a look at Iran, Saudi Arabia making huge efforts to speak to the Iranians. The Emiratis delivering a letter from the White House to the Iranian leadership. I mean, they want to be in the mix on this, and they want to have onus of its success. Because, again, it all goes back to the fact that these are countries which, frankly, have to do well economically, and they cannot, ensure their economic and national security if they're worried about Iran just up the Gulf.
Well, isn't it also the case, Hadley, that, to put it bluntly, Iran's proxies in the region have all been decapitated? I mean, Hezbollah, Hamas,
thanks to Israel,
and the Houthis, right, have all got a bloody nose. You've also got Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who's in his mid-80s. He's thinking about the succession, and frankly, this old chant of death to America is getting a bit tiresome, and they actually want to move forward themselves. Sanctions have been hurting. They want to be pragmatic now and get something done. And there seems to be a bit of a window of opportunity under Donald Trump that they think they might actually get something over the line.
This is a transactional president. This is what he wants. And what he said on the campaign trails again and again and again, we need peace. Yeah. Peace for economic prosperity.
Yeah. Just quick word before we go to a break on the Houthis. Another victory for Trump, just casually mentioned in a press conference with Mark Carney that he's done a deal with the Houthis. I mean, where did that come from?
Fascinating, isn't it? And because I spend a lot of time, obviously, talking to U.S. officials. When I was in Munich, I spoke to someone deeply involved in the Middle East process. And at the time, I asked, what's going to happen with the Houthis? How are they going to take them on? And I was told, well, we're going to bomb the hell out of them. And we saw a little of this in the beginning. And then the fact that he can so quickly flip and change, that's what keeps all of his adversaries on their toes. And he's doing it again, just like we saw in the first administration.
Fascinating discussion so far, Hadley. Thank you so much. I'm in conversation with Hadley Gamble, Chief International Anchor at Al Arabiya. We're discussing all things Middle East, Gaza, Yemen. We haven't touched on Syria yet or Lebanon. Talk about Saudi Arabia, talk about anything you want, because it's a hugely, hugely significant time for the region, and Donald Trump is making his way there tomorrow. What next for the Middle East? Your calls, 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Ali Miraj in conversation with Hadley Gamble on LBC. It's 1:17.
This is LBC. Ali Miraj on LBC. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
Ali Miraj on LBC. It's 1:19. I'm in conversation with Hadley Gamble, Chief International Anchor at Al Arabiya. We're talking all things Middle East. This is open forum for you to get anything off your chest. Ask any question you want. Hadley's across everything. 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. David in Uxbridge, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ali, and good afternoon, Hadley. Thanks for taking my call. So my question's related to Gaza and the plan for America or American private security to take over the aid distribution. And I feel very worried about that. And I want to ask your expert, does she think that that is part of the Israeli plan for expulsion of the Palestinians? So there's two parts to the question. There's that, and does she think it'll work? Because I'm sceptical, because I think UNRWA are the only organisation that can effectively deal with the aid. So I think this is part of the plan for Israel to remove, make Gaza unlivable, which they've done, and it's about the expulsion of Palestinians. Does she agree with that? And what's her assessment of how it'll pan out with the aid, given it's American mercenaries, really, it's not private.
Okay. Understood. Thank you, David. Hadley.
So I look at this in a sort of different way, in the sense that, okay, how does it benefit President Trump if the Palestinians are expelled from Gaza? And my assessment would be that it doesn't in any way, because his Gulf Arab allies and the rest of the region, Jordan, Egypt, et cetera, Lebanon, certainly don't want that to happen. That's right. So that's one of those things that actually the president would probably take a step back on and say, okay, since this doesn't benefit me in any way whatsoever, we need to find a workaround. And in that, you see perhaps the salvation of the Palestinians. And I say that in the context of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. They make it very, very clear that they want peace in the region, stability in the region. We talked a little earlier about Syria. This is something that they have made very, very clear. So if President Trump is going over there and saying, listen, I'm going to keep prices low on oil, which is hurting all of their economies with the exception of Qatar, but I'm going to do a carrot and stick with you. I'm going to, allow perhaps more chips to the UAE, or I'm going to allow perhaps more big deals with Saudi Arabia. And if they're holding out on this because they say what is happening with the Palestinians is unacceptable, that would give him pause. And that would, to my mind, have him talking to Benjamin Netanyahu and saying, back off. So when you talk about what leverage he has over Israel, he's again and again signaled, we're behind Israel, we're behind the Israelis, et cetera. Yet at the same time, this isn't a man that's averse to saying no and stop that.
But even if he says no and stop that, Hadley, I mean, Aaron Etzion, the former deputy head of the National Security Council in Israel, recently said pretty openly that Benjamin Netanyahu was the individual who effectively scuppered the entire peace plan that had been agreed in 3 stages. After the first stage, which was a release of a certain amount of hostages, there was going to be a further release and then movements to reconstruction efforts and all the rest of it. It got scuppered after round 1 because Benjamin Netanyahu's sole purpose is to stay in power. And that's it. So how can you make peace when you have on one side Hamas wanting to eradicate Israel, and on the other side Benjamin Netanyahu now leading a government that wants to basically wipe the Gazans off the map?
This is unfortunately a leader, as you say, who 9 lives, and yet at the same point, this is something that could end his political career. So if he doesn't continue this war, if he doesn't continue making problems, he would potentially go. But the president knows that. Trump knows that. So he's going to use that in any way that he possibly can to get what he wants, which is cessation of hostilities in the region. Now, the bigger question is whether or not that's something that's top of his agenda. And what do we know? Top of his agenda right now is to go to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and make a victory lap and get some deals.
That's what he wants. He wants some deals. David, your thought quickly?
Yeah, I probably agree with that. But I do think, that the question in the short term, at least, is the Palestinians are starving, and they're the sort of crisis is now, and if they're being used in pawns in Trump's bigger game, I think we need to see more from the so-called Western backers of doing more, because people are dying now, and they're dying in large amounts, and so I get the overall bigger picture, and I think the failure is catastrophic of so-called the rules-based order, and I think, because I don't think the plan will work
at all. The tragedy there is, and the history of it, is that the Palestinians are continuously used as pawns. They're pawns of the Hamas government. They're pawns of the Palestinian government. They're pawns in the bigger game,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
They are pawns, but to the point, Hadley, do you think, I mean, in recent months, even I've noticed that as the Israeli government's pronouncements have become more and more extreme, and I'm someone, by the way, who believes that Israel should have had a right to defend itself, but now this is it's moving into a totally different sphere. We haven't really heard much about it. I mean, there was a piece in the FT, the editorial, just the other day, the West's shameful silence on Gaza. What's going on?
With the fact that we have seen every other narrative, the Ukraine-Russia narrative.
I mean, Ukraine's every day.
Every single day, yeah.
It's very odd.
Well, the bigger question is who controls the media organizations, but also, again, 65 years of OPEC. I'm sorry, APEC, excuse me. Let's think about that. They have an incredible media machine.
Is the suggestion you're making, Hadley, that there's a deliberate focus on the Western media not to really delve into this?
I think that the bigger problem is that we have, unfortunately, as you know, in media organizations all over the world, there's less money to do a heck of a lot of news. And there's, unfortunately, a short attention span. And people are still chasing ratings. People are still chasing what gets hits, what gets likes or tweets or whatever it is. That is every single news organization I've ever worked with. So, unfortunately, big stories are pushed off the headlines.
Thank you, Hadley. Thank you, David. Joe in Collierswood, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, both, and thanks for taking my question. If it's okay, I've got a possible proposed solution followed by a question or two, if that's okay.
Please.
So I actually think the two men at the top now, Donald Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, are the two right men, I think. They're very decisive in most things they do, and I think they could make a big difference in this process. So I think the biggest thing for me to outline, first of all, is that Netanyahu and Hamas essentially needs to be off the picture. They need to be put into retirement if we're going to have long-lasting peace. Netanyahu has been causing problems in the Middle East for years, since mid-90s, the Iraq war and all the rest of it that's gone. It's all been pushed by him and AIPAC, as you rightly just mentioned. And then Hamas is a big issue being supported by Iran. I think the US has got Iran where they want them now, following all the stuff that's happened with the Houthis. I think Iran will listen to the US a lot more now, especially with Donald Trump. And so Trump should stop Iran supporting Hamas, which I think is possible. Yep. And the other thing should happen is Netanyahu should go into retirement by Trump putting some pressure on the Israeli government to get rid of him and bring someone a bit more moderate and less extreme. And then in terms of Gaza, it would need complete independence with no Israeli involvement, and it should be run by the Gulf states led by MBS. So my question is, do you think my proposed solution would work? And the second part of that is, would MBS be the right man or would people accept MBS running Gaza? Because I think he's visionary and he can do that sort of thing.
Are you applying for Mike Waltz's job, Joe?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's a vacancy. Go on, Hadley.
Okay, my process of thought would be this. With all due respect to President Trump and to Mohammed bin Salman, who is in fact a visionary leader and has done incredible things for Saudi Arabia thus far, taking on Gaza, taking on this problem, the Palestinian crisis, the war, is something that the Gulf Arab countries just don't want to do. And I look at it from the context of history. Every single time the King of Saudi Arabia in years past, decades past, and other Gulf leaders have attempted to solve the Palestinian issues, they've had problems with the Palestinian leadership, whether it be Yasser Arafat, agreeing to everything and then going back home and changing his mind, to the hijacking of Royal Jordanian. I mean, they have a history of trying to solve the Palestinian crisis and consistently saying they want to, and then getting slapped in the face by various members of Palestinian leadership. So I think the idea that they're going to go in there and make it their problem when they personally feel that they've got a lot of stuff to deal with, just getting their own countries on the right path is probably far-fetched. And that's unfortunate because, the idea that you could take Gaza and turn it into a functioning, healthy economy and life for the Palestinians is what everyone wants.
But to Joe's point, how does one see a situation where Hamas can be extracted from power? I mean, the Israelis have their view, which is take the whole place and just control it and unoccupy it indefinitely. Others may have a different view. But how do you physically prise Hamas from power? And how do you prise Netanyahu from power? I guess Trump's got more leverage over Netanyahu than he does over Hamas.
Well, just as a pure point of speculation, I mean, what the Israelis managed to do in taking out, Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, was absolutely extraordinary. And I was speaking with David Petraeus just a few days later at the Warsaw Security Forum, and he told me, we had things like this at the CIA that we planned, and et cetera. He's like, but I've never seen anything like this. This is incredibly effective, et cetera. So are you really telling me that they don't know at every given moment where the members of Hamas leadership are or what they're doing in Gaza? They must. So my thought process on this is, I've had various conversations over the years with Israelis, with Palestinians in government who've said, we need a boogeyman. We need someone to fight against. It helps our narrative. And I've heard this from the Iranians. I've heard this from Palestinians. I've heard this from Israelis. So, nothing they'll ever say to you on the record, of course, but, they need a boogeyman.
Wow. Joe, quick thought before I go to the news.
Yeah, I think I agree with the end point there. I think Netanyahu needs Hamas and Hamas needs Netanyahu. So that's why we need to get them both off the picture. And the general Israeli public, they just want peace. And if we can get Hamas off the picture, and we can do that by getting Iran to agree to a deal and stop supporting them financially, then that can happen. Well,
Joe, you need to apply for National Security Advisor of the US as well, because you've come up with some interesting thoughts. What next for the Middle East? I'm in conversation with Hadley Gamble, Chief International Anchor for Al Arabiya, answering that very question. All your thoughts on what's obviously happening across the Middle East, not just in Gaza, but also Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. Anything you want to talk about or ask about, please feel free to do so. 0345 6060 973, text 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj at 1:31. The news headlines with Emily Lang.
The Home Secretary's told LBC the government takes attacks on prison officers very seriously. It's after the Southport killer Axel Rudakabana was accused of throwing boiling water over an officer at Belmarsh Prison. Vladimir Putin's insisting he's committed to serious negotiations after proposing peace talks with Ukraine next week. President Zelensky's calling it a positive sign, but says a ceasefire must be in place before any conversations can start. And a second person's been arrested after a 60-year-old man died on a cruise ship last Saturday. James Mesham from West Sussex died following an altercation on the boat during a short trip to Belgium. LBC weather, mostly warm and dry with sunny spells, some thundery showers in the southwest, rain too in southwest Scotland, and highs of 25 degrees.
This is LBC. This is LBC. Message Ali Miraj on WhatsApp now. 0345 6060 973.
Ali Miraj on LBC in conversation with Hadley Gamble, chief international anchor at Al Arabiya, which is, of course, has links with the Saudis, Saudi government, you could say. So I think it's important to just make this point. She's across everything happening in the Middle East, a real expert, has met many of the key players there and is unpicking this conversation with us. What next for the Middle East? 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Hadley, Tony's texted in saying Hadley's interviews with President Putin were excellent. Does she agree that the BRICS and the global south are increasingly more important? The BRICS being Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the rest. Slightly away from our topic, but as you're here, what do you think?
No doubt. But at the end of the day, what we've seen over the last few years since the invasion of Ukraine, and thank you for your kind comment about the interview I did with President Putin. That was in October of 2021.
You were the last journalist before it all kicked off.
Indeed. And this was at a time when European gas prices were up, 100%. And, the real worry was about an energy war, not a physical war. Nobody seemed to think that was possible. And then just a few months later, we saw the invasion of Ukraine. And I spent the first few weeks of that invasion actually in Moscow and watching how that evolved on the Russian side. Because remember, we thought there'd be a run on the banks, that there might be a push on the president. None of that really occurred. But certainly there was a tightening of the message from the Kremlin in those early days. But to your point about the Global South, in subsequent trips that I would make to the World Economic Forum, to the Munich Security Conference, et cetera, after the invasion, there was a consistent narrative from the West, obviously pro-Ukraine, anti-President Putin, what are we going to do? Should we bring them into NATO? All of these things. And then from the Global South, the BRIC countries, the rest of the world, there was increasing skepticism about whether the West had lost their grip on reality in terms of that reaction. And there is a consistent narrative from the folks that I have spoken to over the years, certainly from the Middle East, for example, that Ukraine was Russian territory, that NATO pushed too far, that this was a direct result of subsequent U.S. administrations pushing too far. With Eastern European countries coming into NATO, and that really that he had been provoked. Privately, of course, they would say that they felt it was a huge mistake, the invasion of Ukraine, for a multitude of different reasons, not the least of which it put him in the pocket of Xi Jinping. We just saw Xi and President Putin meeting in the last few days. Yep. But at the same point, they felt as if the Western response was hysteria.
It's so interesting because the narrative, obviously, we should remember that even if many people don't agree with the narrative in countries like the UK, that there are other people across the world that have a completely different view. And it's important to understand that perspective when one comes to these conversations. Harry in Southall, good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon, Ali. Good afternoon to your guest, Hadley, I believe.
Yes,
right?
Hadley, yes, that's right. Go ahead.
Hi there. Look, I'm a simple bloke, right? And I'm also a transactional bloke. Now, I'm thinking about the Middle East situation for some time now. And it seems to me that although I love the idea and principle of a two-state solution, in practice, I can't ever see it working because of extremists and mischief makers on both sides. So I think the only way forward, personally, is for these obscenely wealthy Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, whatever, to say, listen, guys, you're our Muslim brothers, okay? You're going to come into our countries. We're going to set aside a beautiful part of Saudi Arabia for you and give you $1 million each. Get on with it. What's wrong with that?
So, Harry, are you in favour of people forcibly being removed from their own land?
No. What I'm saying is the Saudi Arabia says to the Palestinians, listen, guys, you are having a dreadful time with Israel. We're not going to start a fight with Israel, but whichever one you want to come over here with your families, okay, and forget Hamas, forget the extremists, and live in Saudi Arabia with us, okay, and we're going to set aside a beautiful little part of Saudi Arabia, and we'll give you $1 million each. Okay. You get on with it. Hadley, why wouldn't that work? They've got the money.
Hadley, are they ever going to do that?
No. Hard no. And I think take a look at what happened when the Palestinians were forced to go to Jordan or forced to go to Lebanon, and the social problems that are resulted in that.
They're also worried about
terrorism.
Yeah.
Terrorism and the violence. But the unfortunate thing there is, at the end of the day, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Gulf Arab countries deeply believe that the Palestinians should not be forced from their own land. And the minute that you do that, that means that they are wanderers of the world, as we've seen again and again in the history of
the very fact that we're even talking about this in this way, I do find rather odd. I mean, given the fact that in the space of just a few months now, this whole conversation about shoving them into 25% of their own territory and potentially as a precursor to forcing them out completely from their own land, and the fact that we're just chatting about it in a sort of a blasé fashion, I do find rather odd. Harry, do you find it rather odd?
And okay, Ali, my father lived in what was India. So grandfather lived in India, what became Pakistan in 1947. And he was forcibly kicked out by people who said, right, we want your land because you're now in Pakistan. So he had to walk out with his family out of Pakistan with nothing, okay, and walk into India and start a new life. That's just life, okay. And what I'm saying, nobody forces the Palestinians as much, unfortunately.
So hang on a second, Harry. Whoa. Just a second.
Go.
Isn't that the same argument that Hamas would make about Israel? That, we just want you to move out of it, move out of our former land that we had, move out of it, go and be repatriated somewhere else. It's just life.
Yeah, no, I get that. But what I'm saying, what's realistically more possible? And if Saudi Arabia was to say, anybody who wants to, from Palestine, who's a Palestinian, is welcome to Saudi Arabia. We're going to set aside some land for you to start.
I don't think it's going to happen, Harry. It's never going to happen for the reasons that Hadley outlined, particularly what happened in Jordan. But it's an interesting concept, but I don't think it's ever going to come to pass. Thank you for your call. Lucy in Bristol, good afternoon.
Hello. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Thanks for having me on. So my question is a bit of a stretch. So it's really, I'm curious. How has the woman-led Free Iran movement influenced, if at all, political and social change across the Middle East? And has it had any effect at all, do you think, whether that's symbolic or practical, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
This is like an academic question at the LSE, Lucy. Go on, Hadley.
Certainly symbolically. I mean, the videos and the tape that we would see coming. You can tell how old I am, Lucy, that I'm talking about tape. But the images that we would see coming out of Iran, of the women's-led movement, were incredibly inspiring. I think, whether you be Shia, Sunni, whatever, this was an incredible time. But the idea, again, subsequently, that the Iranian movement internally was ever going to overthrow this theocracy, was ever going to overthrow the Iranian government. We've had those hopes again and again and again, and it never seems to be able to push it over the top, if you will, to come to fruition. But symbolically, yes, it's been important. It's always highlighted at all the conferences that I attend, whether they're political defense conferences. Yep. You have these leading voices. But in terms of how it's had an impact on the Palestinian conflict.
Generally across the Middle East, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because Ali and I were speaking just a bit earlier. Back in 2009, when I used to go to Saudi Arabia, it was a very, very different country. Even the UAE was quite conservative in those days. And I think that the enormous change that we've seen, even just in the last few years, with the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, with all of these Saudi students who are educated abroad wanting to come back to Saudi Arabia because the jobs and the opportunities are there in a way that they aren't finding in the West. And also the idea that these are young countries and they're building something entirely new. Yeah. There's an enthusiasm there, both men and women, that I think I would never have anticipated had someone told me back in 2009, 2010, prior to the Arab Spring, that this would be, the center of creativity and hope and optimism. I probably would not have believed them.
But Hadley, it's come a long way since the killing of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old who defied the ethical police in Iran for her dress. I mean, things have moved on massively since then. I mean, we now hear that, in fact, these morality police are being berated themselves. And in fact, things are much more liberal. So there has been movement, hasn't there? Yes,
but I think that the big question is, from the top down, how much impact has, what's happened with Hezbollah, what's happened with Hamas, with what's happened in the broader sort of what we used to call the Shia axis, which is no longer in existence, right?
Well, it doesn't. The axis of resistance is a thing of the past.
It is indeed.
Lucy, your thoughts?
There's a lot to unpick there, I have to admit. Even just mentioning Mahsa Amini, I'm aware that she is a Kurdish Iranian, and that just automatically makes me think of what's happening in Syria at the moment in regards to the sort of, the Kurdish community and what's going on to them.
Remind us, Lucy, for the listeners, explain what you mean, please.
So I don't know where to start, to be honest. it's really, really chaotic.
It is.
Yeah.
And Turkey have got an interest in ensuring that doesn't spread to their region either. So they've also been having an input into what's going on there. And there's unrest all over the place. And now you've got Ahmed al-Shara, who's the guy who's running the place, former radical who's trying to court the West, doing what he's doing, but also clamping down, as we understand, on the Alawites. So it's all a bit of a mess. Go on, Lucy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll say on final point, just because I genuinely cannot identify any of the points that have been mentioned as the one that I can potentially talk about. But I would just like to say that I really do hope that decisions made moving forward do genuinely inspire resistance and shift alliances for the better in the entire Middle East. But, it's... I can't imagine it ever will, really, to the point, where the majority are happy and living a healthy life.
Well,
there's too much money to be made from that region.
We live in hope, Lucy, because things have massively moved. I mean, even Hadley, in her time in the region, things have moved hugely in recent years. And indeed, since Mohammed bin Salman's taken over Saudi Arabia, things have moved hugely, and they're even moving in Iran as well. So there is hope, and we have to live in the possibility that things will improve. Lucy, thank you for your call. I'm in conversation with Hadley Gamble, Chief International Anchor at Al Arabiya, on the question, which is what next for the Middle East. We've talked a lot about Gaza. We've touched on a little bit on what's happening in Iran. We haven't really talked about Syria yet, or Lebanon, or Yemen in particular. And we've touched a little bit on Saudi Arabia. But anything you want to ask, anything that's on your mind in this fascinating region, which is going through turbulence, but also is a huge economic opportunity, and also increasingly of international geopolitical significance as well. It's up for you to ask whatever you want. What next for the Middle East? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Ali Miraj on LBC in conversation with Hadley Gamble. It's 1:46.
LBC coming up next week on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Was it a trade triumph on the international stage?
Mr. Prime Minister, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a really fantastic, historic day.
But now attention turns to the domestic front with a pledge to deal with Britain's border crisis.
Mass migration is making us poorer. Mass migration means our kids and grandkids can't get houses.
Join me as we react to the government's immigration crackdown.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, and the new LBC app. This is LBC with Ali Miraj.
Ali Miraj on LBC. It's 1:49. I'm in conversation with Hadley Gamble, Chief International Anchor at Al Arabiya, which is a Saudi station, as you will know. We're talking about all things in the Middle East. And there's plenty to discuss, a huge amount. And we've made quite a lot of progress so far. You've got about 10 minutes to get your calls in. 0345 6060 973, text 84850. In the break, Hadley, you were telling me that Iraq, which we haven't touched on in this conversation so far, which was a basket case following that cack-handed invasion and the demise of Saddam Hussein, is facing a construction boom. What's going on?
It is. It's fascinating, actually. And I was just actually in Erbil several months ago, and I was speaking to the Prime Minister, Mr. Barzani, and we were talking at that time about the oil law. That's something that they hadn't been able to agree with on Baghdad, because they're supposed to give, obviously, a certain amount of their revenue, their oil revenue, to the state, to Baghdad, right? And that's been an ongoing battle between, Erbil and Baghdad for a long time now. But he said, "Have you been to Baghdad lately?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you might notice something different, which is an absolute construction boom. All the money that can't get out of Iraq, because it was, illicit funds. It was basically money that was coming from Iran via Iraq and being washed, no doubt through the import-export bank through America's New York Fed. Now that they've stopped that money has nowhere to go, and it's sitting in Baghdad and it's being put to work. And so, what an incredible time! Something we didn't think that we would see is sort of this a situation where rents in Iraq are rising.
Really?
Yes. This is
everywhere.
And quite frankly, stability. That's another thing. The subsequent prime ministers, we had so many problems for so many years post-invasion, violence and gangs and et cetera. It's not happening now.
Really?
There's a calm. So this is very interesting. It's a very interesting time, which just adds to the narrative of the economic prosperity.
Would you go on holiday there yet?
Well, I know people who do.
How interesting. Thank you, Hadley. Andre in Leighton, good afternoon.
Yes, Ali and Hadley. It's a real treat listening to Hadley with that sort of brilliance, insight, razor-sharp wit. Now, I've got a question addressed to her about what you might call a proper, full decolonization of North Africa, the Middle East, and the Fertile Crescent. Now, I like to listen to Sarah Payne. She's an American naval historian, and Jonathan Sachs.
You're not talking about the hockey mum?
No, not. I got told off before about that. No, she's a very distinguished lecturer at, I think, Newport Naval College. So she's right on the inside, but she has a lot of criticism. And so the point is, how would we go about a proper decolonization of North Africa?
But who's colonizing the Middle East at the moment and North Africa?
Well, we only need to look at the debacle of the Iraq War and Syria and Libya to see that it doesn't require, in fact, even subtle, disguised imperialism.
Okay.
And of course, because there's a very tight interlock between the American petrodollar empire and what Saudi does or doesn't do, and therefore what Israeli doesn't do. And it's all, there's an obvious interlock, both financially and militarily.
Okay, I think we've got something to work with it. So to summarize this, Hadley, I mean, look, Andre makes this point. The West has been interfering in the affairs of the Middle East for years. I mean, you even go back we were talking about Iran earlier, go back to Mossadegh's deposition when they installed the Shah. Why? Because it was all about oil.
Yes.
Right? And then that whole thing has continued till the late 70s until he got deposed. And then there was a standoff for the next 45 years, which may end now if Trump gets this peace deal done. So he's making a decent point, Andre, here.
Yes, and go back hundreds of years, the Catholic Church in Lebanon and what they've managed to do or not do in that country. Take a step back and think about it. I mean, in order for these countries to take onus of their own foreign policy, of their own, forward planning, they've had to really recognize who is their ally and who is not their ally. And I think, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, I talked a little bit about Barack Obama and the pivot to Asia and how psychologically that impacted the Gulf Arab countries, for example. You have that huge American base in Bahrain, obviously the naval base, and then you've obviously got an air base in Qatar, and et cetera, and you've also got some strategic points in the UAE and in Saudi. I think that the question is always, okay, so if we can't depend on the United States in the way that we used to, how do we then forward plan? And I think that the rise of China in the region and the huge economic deals that they've done in the last few years is part of that. And also looking east as opposed to just consistently looking west for strategic, not just economic projects and long-term economic gains, but also in terms of security. Do they want to be decolonized? That's another question. If they can use U.S. power or China power to their advantage, why wouldn't they want to keep a foothold?
But
do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. But on the colonization point, to use Andre's words, I don't think it's particularly helpful. But the interference by Western powers, you go back to the Iraq War, which was a complete nonsense. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people killed. Deposed this guy, led to complete chaos over there. Now you're telling us it's improving. But it wasn't for many, many years. To what end? I mean, even if we're now seeing an America First isolationism, it actually might, from a Middle East point of view, be no bad thing if it's focused around economics rather than interference militarily in other people's affairs.
Well, certainly the American president has made so secret of the idea that he wants people to take care of their own problems. And if they can do that, and that falls in line with his, we want peace, all over the world, then that's great. And he'll feel like he achieved something.
Do you think that the Middle East states are becoming more transactional? We read about the transactional 25 states in the world who are not really aligning, like the old non-aligned movement. They're not in the Western US sphere of influence anymore. Is that happening in the Middle East as well? Are they looking at things on their merits and deciding who they're going to partner with?
They have long recognized that economic security means national security, whether it be in terms of managing their resources, oil, natural gas, minerals. You've got, I think, $1 trillion of untapped mineral reserves in the region now that we know about. This is something that they've now recognized. And if you look at just the performance of the sovereign wealth funds, whether it be Mubadala, for example, or the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, the returns they're getting are significant. They are doing well. They're playing at a scale that perhaps they weren't a few years ago.
They're not just buying football clubs.
Well, they are sophisticated investors. See, so these are folks who have the reins of government, right? The reins of economic power, and they're not going to let them go.
They're also investing not only in hard economic projects, but also in social influence as well through the Saudi Pro League and other things, and that whole vision, the Live Golf Tour and all of it. And we talk about these things, but this is exactly what the US did for years through Hollywood and other things. The social influence, and we used to do through the British Council, same thing. Andre, final thought to you?
Yes. I mean, one of the questions is how much it actually suits the peoples of the Middle East to go for what you might call, classical 19th century bourgeois liberal nation statehood rather than a more pan-Arab league. I mean, because, Britain, we don't really have enough power to run our own state apart from the success of the Southeast London, the City of London. So emergent states, the question is what I hear you laughing. That's true from wearing my Marxist hat. And so the question is what, in fact, is the correct vehicle of national self-determination? Is it the state in the Middle East?
Okay, well, that's another Oxford seminar question that you're chucking in today. Well, I mean, look at the quality of the callers today, Hadley. Andre, thank you very much indeed for that, for teasing us intellectually as you always do. Mike has texted in on this, which is interesting and important. What are your thoughts, Hadley, on the new president of Syria, Ahmed Hossein al-Shara? What is the vision? How is he accommodating the religious minorities? Is he pushing back against the Israeli occupation?
I think this is a very interesting one. And one, I think that just look at what the Gulf has done so far. They've decided that they want a stable Syria, right?
Yes.
And they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Sanctions being lifted.
Sanctions being lifted. The Saudis and the Emiratis, committing money to that end.
That's right.
Which is at a time, by the way,
debt.
You got it. Which is at a time, frankly, when they're looking after their own countries because oil is under 60.
Yep.
So this is Saudi Arabia. I mean, extraordinary levels of investment at home and abroad. That says to me that they're going to take a long-term interest. And certainly with what we've seen now with Lebanon, the idea that the Syrian leader might speak to Benjamin Netanyahu, that there might be some kind of overture, in person, is probably a long shot, but you never know. Given what we've seen over the last few years, anything's possible. But this is a person that has clearly got his eye on a long-term trajectory in Syria, this new president. And I have a feeling that with the backing of the Gulf Arab countries, at least in these early years, that's something that they want, and a stable Syria could be in the offing. So I wouldn't want to be too optimistic. You can't be too optimistic when you talk about the Middle East. But we all live in hope.
We do live in a lot of hope, and it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, Hadley. We're very, very grateful if you take time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us and engage with our audience. We'll follow and continue to track your career, which is always in the ascendancy, with great interest, and look to see also how the Middle East develops in the coming years, both economically, politically, and also geopolitically. Hadley, thank you so much for joining us. What a fascinating conversation that was. Now, coming up in the final hour, the head of the Prison Officers Union has said that the most dangerous prisoners should be kept in US-style supermax conditions with no contact with other inmates or cooking facilities. This is on the back of Axel Rudikabana attacking an officer in the last few days. This obviously also follows on the back of Hesham Abedi doing exactly a similar thing, another attack only a few weeks ago. This is becoming a serious consideration for the protection of the officers involved and the fact that these individuals are getting out of control. Should Britain's most dangerous criminals be kept in solitary confinement?
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 2 o'clock, the Home Secretary has told LBC migration must be properly controlled and the government intends to